Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. The Lanson Commission on Obesity has just released an immensely important report. Led by the University of Auckland, the George Washington University, and the World Obesity Federation. The new Lanson Commission is the result of a 3-year project led by 26 experts from 14 countries. The commission states that globally some 4 million deaths each year are linked to obesity, and some 815 million people are seriously undernourished. These figures are alarming and indicate how two of the greatest risks to human health, obesity and undernutrition, are rising rapidly. With the global epidemic of malnutrition, we discuss today the far-reaching implications of poor nutrition and how lethal it can be. We also try to discuss today and explore ways in which we can take control of this matter and ensure a future that is more safe for human life. To talk about this further, we are joined by Aneeq Alam, who is a nutritionist. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Aneeq. Mr. Aneeq, before we get into this debate, I want to understand how you would define malnutrition.
Well, malnutrition is the failure of the body to properly absorb vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients from food.
Okay. And does that include obesity as well as undernourishment?
More undernourishment, because the nutritional deficiencies used to develop when the absorption is not occurred.
Okay. This body resistant to absorbing.
The common symptoms include constipation, diarrhea, dry skin, fatigue, mental difficulties, inability to concentrate, muscle cramps, weaknesses, and so on.
Okay. So how do environmental factors attribute towards malnutrition? For example, the climate, poverty.
Yes, poverty is one of the main factors, because the children, they are not getting the food which they need it, and that is for the stunting is there, and they are not getting the right food at the right time. And number one is the poverty. Number two is the education. Even the families who can afford, they don't have the mothers. They should know what to give to the children. That is a one problem.
Okay.
So awareness is one of the factors to the mothers.
And in that awareness, can you tell us a little about what are the main points that mothers especially need to be aware of while they're providing nutrition to their children?
Yes. First of all, they should know what they have to give to the children, because the children, many of the mothers, they are working mothers, and usually the children are on the diet, which is mostly what you call the fat diets, and processed foods. The processed food is one of the things which is making a problem for the children, for their absorption. They are not eating the fruits, they are not eating the vegetables, they are not taking the milk, the things which they need it. And they are taking the sugary items, Coke, Pepsi, all the sugars items, and the sugars and the sweets.
Yeah.
And this is making a problem, and because of this, there is a combination of anemia, diarrhea, and weight loss. You can see it typically of this syndrome.
And Mr. Aneeq, I do want to talk about all anemia and diarrhea and all those things that come up due to a poor nutritional diet. But before that, could you tell us about the main food groups and what balance people need to strike between that? Because of course there is this misconception that processed sugars and natural sugars, they might be the same things and everything needs to be given in the same proportion. But is that true?
Well, there always be what I used to say to the children, to the mothers, the balanced diet, if I'm talking about a plate, the plate should have a quarter of the plate should have a fruit, quarter of the plate should have a vegetables, and the quarter should have the meat and eggs and all those things, so that they can get the protein, carbohydrates, starch, everything. We are emphasizing only one item, and that is the main problem. The children should have everything in proportionate, in proportions.
Okay. And do you believe that there are any dietary trends which are causing for this malnutrition to increase or to at least remain the same, to prevail, in terms of how there are so many different dietary trends coming up, the protein diet, keto diet? Do you think that leads to these issues?
Well, for the children, no.
And for adults?
For adults, yes. They can have, but what I used to suggest is, before going to any diet, they should consult a proper physician, a nutritionist, and they should have their own blood, take for starting anything, they should check their blood levels, chemistries, because sometimes the people, they are taking the protein diet, and they're not checking their kidneys. What's the effect on the kidneys? So at least, first of all, they should check their biochemistry, the blood test, and then consult someone. Don't do it yourself.
And there's a report by the Ministry of Planning, Development and Reform which states that almost 177,000 children die annually in Pakistan before their 5th birthday, largely attributed to malnutrition. So, of course, this situation has tremendous implications. Can you tell us about how dangerous malnutrition is exactly, so people are aware as to how dangerous it can be?
Well, as I mentioned you that they die because of the anemia, because they have a very low hemoglobin levels. They have a lot of diarrheas going on, and they died with that, and they don't have the access to the hospitals, and that is the reason the deaths are occurring.
And Mr. Alam, in this regard, it's a common perception to think that the human body is adaptable to the situation it is placed in. For example, if it's placed in a hot climate, it will adapt to that. If it's placed in a cold climate, it will adapt to that. But what about poverty? What about if there is no access to food and nutrition? Do you think that the human body adjusts to that, is able to cope to it?
No, they can't. When they are not getting the right amount of vitamins, minerals, nutrients, how could they survive?
Yeah.
They can't survive with that. So this is the reason.
And can you tell us about how obesity affects the brain development differently than undernutrition?
Obesity, well, obesity is because if you're talking about the children, or if you're talking about the adults for obesity.
We can first talk about the children, but I would like your take on how it affects adults differently as well.
Well, for the children, because you might have seen in the schools that the obesity is now a very common thing, because the children are taking diet which is not good for them. The processed food, number one. They are on the burgers and the pizzas and everything, like that. But no exercise, because the children mostly, what everybody have seen, that they are on the mobile phones, they are on the tabs and doing nothing, no sports. Even the schools are in the houses, so they don't have any sports and exercise and the physical training. So when they are not getting a physical training or exercises, how can they absorb the things properly? And this is the same thing which will apply to the adults also. We have lack of exercise. What we are eating, we are not consuming that thing. And that is the problem with the obesity. And the number one thing is the sugar.
And Mr. Alam, you mentioned here processed foods. I wonder, do you think that organic foods and organic farming could be a solution to this problem?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Please tell us about that, how that would be different than the processed foods.
Well, in the processed food, they add many things, which are not good for the health. Okay? Say, for example, monosodium glutamate. They are adding it to enhance the flavor. And again, it's good for the health. For when we are talking about the organic things, the organic, what's the difference between organic and the natural, the other one, The only thing, if you are talking about the vegetables, they're not putting the insecticides and the pesticides.
Yeah.
This is the one reason, and they are putting them, manure things, the old methods one. So that's a good, sign, and that's a good food for the. Now, if you are talking about the other things like what we call the desi chicken and the eggs, so those are good, better than the other ones. Now we are talking about the, say for example, wheat. Now wheat is, 100 years before, wheat is not that one right now in this period, because there is a mutation in it, to enhance the yield of the food.
Yeah.
So that is the one reason that everybody is getting fat, everybody is getting obese. So this is one of the reasons.
So much, Dr. Aneeq Alam, for joining us and talking to us about this important issue.
You're welcome.
We are now joined by Vita, who is a mother from Indonesia. Thank you so much for joining us, Vita.
Sure.
So, Vita, could you tell us about how you think a diet, a healthy diet, should be maintained for children?
Well, I always believe everything in moderation is the way to go. So, like the fact that we live in Indonesia, we don't have a lot of access to organic food or, a lot of the well-researched wheat or all sorts of good beans and seeds, that's good for obviously everyone.
Yeah.
So the fact that we don't have access to that, what does that leave us? So my point always to my kids is stay away from sugar, but everything else, eat as many variations as possible and always in moderation. So all the colors, green, red, yellow, brown, everything, as many colors as possible and as much variety as possible. So a lot of kids only have white diets, just the pasta, the rice, and that's not good, right? And a lot of kids have, other kind of diet. And I think also there's a downside to that. But if I want to focus solely only on the organic food, and so I know that it's good, but if it's not accessible, what do we do in Indonesia, right? So one day eggs is good for you, the next day eggs is not good for you. So tofu is good and tofu is not. But I think everything in moderation would be great for the kids.
And Vita, I wonder, in the process of creating a healthy diet for your children, is a lot of research involved? Do you have to go out of your way to find out which product is safe, which is not?
Yes, definitely. I usually I say no to all canned product because that is something that I can avoid. So since they were babies, they're used to not have processed food. I always make a point of cooking my own food. But again, do I stop them? If they want to have a chocolate bar or cheese balls or anything like that when they're with their friends, no. But do I stop them from having it every day at home? Yes. So I do a lot of research in terms of what is healthy, what is really good, and I try to provide that at home. But, I don't make a strict diet and saying, okay, you can never have this. Because, I need them to develop the habit of avoiding it anyway. Like, they don't have a taste bud for soda, let's say now, because I never give them soda when they were little. So they always want a nice cold water, to go with everything that they eat.
And that's a very interesting.
Just trying to create a good habit.
And that's a very interesting point that you said, that you didn't let a palate for soda develop. And that is something I would like to talk about how parents need to be more aware of the fact that the children only learns to develop a flavor that you feed it in the early stages. So if you don't give them sugar, they won't get hooked onto it. So tell us, how did you moderate that early on when your kids were very young?
Yeah, so when they were babies, as I said, right, I tried to cook everything. And I think also doing research for myself helped me, right, because I avoid those kind of things. And they see what I eat, right? And you tend to feed your kids what you like, I think. So the knowledge that you put in yourself about what's good for you, I think translate really well on your babies, on your little kids. And a lot of parents, I think, have the illusion of thinking, oh, it's okay, they're just children now, they'll develop it later on. But as we all know, once the habit sets in, it's going to be harder, right, to say no to them.
Yeah.
Especially when they can talk back and they get their own food outside, it's going to be hard. So I think just by putting it away, not drinking it yourself, I think that is the best way of transferring that knowledge to them.
And you're talking about transferring of knowledge, but also something that transfers from mothers to children is during the process of when you have conceived the child and very early on when you are when the child is very, very young. So can you tell us what is the most essential thing for mothers who are bearing children to keep in mind in terms of nutrition?
The most essential things, I think, to keep in mind is just eat food. You know what I mean? Eat food that is food, not food that has already been processed so many times. You know what I mean? Like a lot of food that tastes like plastic but tastes like cheese.
Yeah.
But if you actually eat real cheese, they don't taste like cheese, right? So I think what's important to me, as I said, like eat food. Don't eat processed food.
Yeah.
And then also moderation and a lot of variety, so that your kids don't grow up being very picky, because once they're picky, it's very hard to feed them, right? And it's sometimes we panic when they don't eat certain things, and we said, okay, then just eat the cookies. I'd rather you eat the cookies than you're hungry. You know what I mean? So I think developing that just ability to just taste everything, try everything, and be open about everything. Of course, that would have to come from us, the parents, because as you say, right, it's monkey sees, monkey do, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So we have to create that culture, that environment.
And Vita, you talked about processed foods here, and since you are someone who immerses herself in research before creating a diet, how difficult do you find going out shopping? Because labels on food items these days can often be very, very deceptive. For example, if a juice is put in a recycled material, one might assume it's organic, which does not necessarily mean it is. So labels tend to misinform consumers. So how do you navigate through that?
So whenever I go to the supermarket, my kids I would take the stuff that I usually want. And that's usually, the mushroom, the meat, the chicken, the fish, and stuff like that. And then sometimes, of course, they go down the aisle and then they look at the cereal, they look at, all the snacks, right?
Yeah.
So I think since they were little, I always make it a point to read the labels in the back.
Okay.
Certain things would put a red flag on it, like palm oil. Or the amount of grams of sodium and the amount of sugar is the most concerning for me. And then also like other things, I said if you can't read it, then don't eat it. You know what I mean? Like a lot of the Energizer, what do you call it? The Energized bars.
Yeah.
You know, they
Energy
said,
bars.
oh, it's healthy, but it's loaded with calories that you don't need, loaded with sugar that you don't need, right?
And that's a great point.
Then it always...
Yeah. That
Yeah,
if you
have a
can
lot of
decipher
things
the
that-
label, it's not worth getting
Yeah,
that
if
product.
you can spell it, you can pronounce it, probably don't eat it,
Yeah.
right?
Don't put
So
it in.
I always joke around with my kids and said, okay, try and spell it or try and read that, you know. And if you can't read it, you can't spell it, then probably just stay away from it and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
So just eat food, like grab food. If they grab nuts or, you know, any kind of nuts, pine nuts, seeds and all that, you know, I'm fine.
Yeah.
And then, of course, once in a while you can eat snacks. I'm not that, you know, that kind of
That
mother
picky.
who said
Okay,
no
so
to all the fun, right?
Vita,
Yeah.
stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Let's continue our discussion. We also have another joining us, Qasim Khan Tareen, who is an organic farmer. Thank you so much for joining us, Qasim. Qasim, can you tell us about what dietary trends that you see emerging right now, which you find extremely problematic?
Well, it is, as mentioned earlier, is an increased dependence on processed foods and foods that are easily accessible, readily available, and convenient. So these dietary trends will have and are having, you know, negative consequences. As a recent UN study has shown, it is approximately 44% of all infants in Pakistan are now considered malnourished.
Yes. And do you feel like this is a problem with the food system in terms of how we have started farming, how we have started producing food over excess of production?
It is. It's definitely a weakness in the current system that can be rectified. And also important to note, consumers a role to play in this, you know, because farmers and the food system will only produce what they can sell. So if people want more of processed foods, then I'm afraid the farmers got very little to do with processed food, you know. It'll just be made from food extracts like high fructose corn syrup and palm oil.
Those are the principles of the demand and supply in a market system. But you mentioned here that the system can be rectified. How do you think it can be?
Well, again, it's something that, you know, we've been working on for the last 6 years, is to increase the number of farmers markets and platforms where food producers can directly interact with food consumers. Yeah. You know, because there's a very large gap between the two. From the time that your food is produced to the time that it actually ends up on your plate, there are a number of steps, there are a number of hands, and there are a number of stages and processes that it has to go through. So the more that is minimized, the simpler it is made, the better. Okay. So that is one way, and that's also, it's not a very expensive way. We're talking about actually making a complicated system, a complex system, simpler, cheaper, and easier for both the producer and grower of food and the consumer. Yeah. That's a great point there, Qasim. And with that, I want to take a question to us. She mentioned earlier that there is an inaccessibility of organic foods. So can you tell us more about that so we get a global perspective of whether or not organic foods, there's an awareness regarding it, if people want it, if consumers seek it out?
Definitely surrounding me, my friends and I, of course, we seek it out, right? Because we all know, you know, it's probably safer and healthier in a a more natural environment that foods are grown. But the problem is it's not very accessible. So, and even if it's accessible, it's not, the price range is still very high. Yeah. So only the limited amount of people can afford it, right? So what are we going to do about that? I'm conflicted, honestly, but that's off topic. So if I can, like chicken and eggs, if I can get a hand on organics, because that is the one thing we consume a lot, then I will try my best to always get organic chicken or organic eggs.
And Vita, here you mentioned you and your friends try to seek it out. So I'm assuming there's a sense of awareness amongst the community regarding
definitely.
how bad processed foods is. So did you all jump to this conclusion together, or was it over a duration of time when you realized how damaging processed foods can be?
I think for me, it's been, because I move around countries as well, and everywhere I go, there seems to be a notion that processed food is not the way to go, at least for now. I'm not a scientist, right? Some food, people say, oh, it's better processed because you don't have, it's not contaminated by this and this and this and this, depending on where you live, right? Not all fresh milk is better than the highly processed milk in some countries, maybe, right?
Yeah.
It's not even Indonesia sometimes, right?
Yeah.
So the notion of that, natural versus organic versus non-organic, processed versus not, it has been around for a long time. People, I think, are recognizing it more and more, and people are more brave now. Farmers are more brave now and have the capital to support it. So it's growing. It's definitely growing.
Okay.
As for the future, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure how visible that. The more people in this earth, I find it very hard maybe to grow natural food.
Yeah, it seemed to be a complicated process. And with that, Qasim, I'd like to ask you, since you are very well aware of how this process works, how complicated is it exactly, organic farming?
So it's organic food is definitely simpler and more sustainable. So the number of sort of inputs or money or capital required is much less than conventional farming. Because essentially you're relying on natural inputs like animal manures, composts, and you also, if you want to be sustainable, you also then have to get more efficient irrigation systems. So all of this does actually decrease the cost of production when you compare the two. And it's one thing that a lot of consumers also, I think, are beginning to grow aware of is that it's very actually easy to grow your own food. Even if you're doing it, just on a household basis. So rooftop gardening, backyard chickens, small vegetable patches out in the front of your lawn. And then, of course, getting in touch with local farmers and farmers markets. Yeah. But yes, relatively compared to conventional food, the accessibility is definitely a major hurdle. Yeah. You cannot just walk into any shop or any grocery store or vegetable and fruit stall and expect to get organic produce. But the way to go, I think, with eating organic is to be as self-sufficient as possible. And also to make a little bit of extra effort to find out what local farmers in your area are growing and where they're located.
Yeah. And Qasim, hold on to that thought. I want to ask you some more questions. But before that, I'm just going to ask a last question here. So you've heard expertise from someone who is in the field of organic farming, Qasim here. And he's saying that it is, in fact, very easy to start producing in your kitchen garden in your home. So would you, is that something that you would think about doing in the near future?
Oh, definitely. Although I kill everything I touch. But I definitely would love to be able to grow my own herbs and my own, salad, But I think that is probably possible for most of us here in Jakarta. But to do the chicken and the eggs, that's probably going to be a bit more difficult just because a lot of us live in an apartment building. So a high rise doesn't allow us to have that access, right? But if it's accessible, then the education about it is available by a lot of, maybe the government should be involved in it, right? Then that would be great. You know, if everyone can be more conscious about growing their own food so they don't waste food, right? I think we can conserve a lot of this food, you know, natural food around us.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely for it.
Qasim, could you give any suggestions to Vita here regarding how she can get into the process of organic farming? You've heard all the problems she stated.
So, Vita, I mean, from what I've just you can see on the screen, you're in Jakarta, and I know that in the region, especially in places like Hong Kong and Singapore, and a lot of other sort of densely populated urban areas, there has been an administrative, a proactive government movement to making urban spaces greener. This, I mean, not only helps people sort of grow their own food, but it also then, you know, reduces carbon footprints of cities and makes them a lot more energy efficient. So I would suggest maybe trying to find some programs in Jakarta that might be similar to what Singapore and Hong Kong are doing. You know, there was a great project I was reading about in Australia. I think it might have been Sydney or Melbourne, where again, you know, real estate is becoming very expensive.
So Vita, you've heard what Qasim has to say, and before I let you go, is there any advice you'd give to mothers out there to have to create a more healthy diet for their children?
Yeah, as I said before, I think the most effective knowledge transfer is by doing. So if you're eating right, I think your kids will pick it up. And then varieties and moderation, I think that's the key to have it sustainable, you know, to have it long last so that when they grow up, they can pick up the same habit and then transfer it to their kids.
Yeah.
I think that's the main thing.
That's a great point there, Vita. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll continue our discussion now with Qasim. Qasim, something that you mentioned here was carbon footprints when you were giving advice to Vita, and that's something I want to ask you. How is the climate impacted when we use mass production processes and when we try to go on the route which is not organic?
Well, one of the biggest sort of impacts that your food has on climate change is food miles. You know, how far your food is traveling before it reaches your plate. So obviously, when it comes to imported food, you're talking about very sort of carbon-heavy food that you're consuming. So that is something that I think a lot of consumers have to think about and debate when they're making their food choices. And when it comes to locally growing food, again, conventional agricultural's heavy reliance on chemical fertilizers that are produced with essentially very gas-heavy, industrial units. These, recently you would have read about how a lot of our fertilizer industry has been given gas subsidies or have been given gas supplies at subsidized rates. Now, obviously, you're talking about a fossil fuel that is being consumed or used to produce a chemical fertilizer that is not only going to deplete the nutrients in your soil in the long run and have a detrimental effect on the long run on soil, but is then also producing food that is has less nutritional value. So there is, a lot of the climate change can be impacted severely through agricultural practices.
And Qasim, hold on to that thought. That's a very important point there. And before we move on, we take this discussion further, I'd like to introduce another guest who's joined us, Mr. Tofiq Pasha, who is a farmer. Thank you so much for joining us on this show again. So you were listening to what Qasim had to say about how the environment is getting degraded because of our unhealthy processes of producing food. What can you also tell us about that?
It's a very frightening scenario, actually, to be able to feed this amazing size of a population we've got, and 220 million people. And nobody can afford to even have 3 days of food shortages in the country. So yes, it is extremely frightening. It's not only the fertilizers that are being used, it's the chemicals that are being sprayed on the plants to kill pests and take care of diseases. Unfortunately, right now, the world we are living in, and especially our third world countries, as we call them, things are pretty bad. Our atmosphere is completely polluted. Our water is completely polluted. Our soil is polluted. All our food is grown very artificially. Our meat, chickens, milk, it's all got chemicals in it. And you are seeing the results of it. We already see so much more disease than we did 30 years ago.
Yeah. And Mr. Pasha, we were discussing the Lanson report earlier and how it talks about how both undernutrition and obesity can be driven by the same faulty policies of the global system. So the global system is at fault here when we're talking about how food lacks nutrition. What can you tell us about that?
Well, obviously, when everything is being grown artificially, so there's bound to be lacking nutrition. See, it's very simple to notice that. So, when you go abroad, you find that the fruit and vegetables have a much longer shelf life. But everybody who comes back from abroad says, "Ki haan, size to bahut bada hai, but there's no flavor in it." So you actually, to make the size bigger and to give it a longer shelf life, you have to remove some of the nutrients from the fruit. That is a sacrifice that modern day has made. So the fruit is not as tasty and as nutritional as it was. So that is with everything. It's everything that we are eating today is grown artificially. Like I said, milk, eggs, chicken, meat, it's all being grown artificially. So bound to, it's like, those little stories you keep hearing about rice and lettuce being made out of plastic. So that is what it is. It's just to fill the stomach, but the nutrition value is not there.
And that's a great point you mentioned there. Something that I would also like Qasim to comment on is that sacrifice that Mr. Pasha suggested that people are making in order to have a longer shelf life for food. Do you think that sacrifice is worth it?
Well, I mean, when food making or food producing becomes a business, then everybody is looking at, bottom line costs. So it's about, all the wrong factors determining your food choices. As a consumer, you want the cheapest food. As a producer, or a distributor, you want to maximize your profits. You need a very strong awareness campaign to actually make people realize that nutritional food is the most important thing. People will not think twice about buying an expensive car because they realize that, this car's quality is higher, hence the price is more, When it comes to food, unusually or, very oddly, people don't have that thinking. Definitely. And as a producer or a distributor, again, you want to maximize your yields in the shortest span of time. You want to sell very large volumes and make a lot of, profits.
Definitely.
So, I mean, if economics alone are going to determine food choices, then yes, there's the health, and the environmental aspects are completely ignored.
Yeah. And on that thought, I want to ask Mr. Pasha last question here. So something that Qasim talked about was that if you can afford a very expensive car, you should also invest the same money in food products. But we do know that there's a great disparity between income levels for those who can afford these organically produced items and those who cannot. So what policies need to be implemented in order to create a system where those even at the lowest end of the spectrum can afford all this food that is healthy and nutritional?
Now, this is something I was going to say it, but I was going to say it in a different way.
Okay.
For the time being, like I said, 220 million plus people we have. And if we were to try and feed them growing food organically with the facilities that are available today, we would have a famine on our hands. We would have hunger, and food security would have it would topple any government. So today it is not possible to grow food organically and feed this population. The reason why we converted into chemically grown food, into fertilizers and pesticides, was to increase our yields because we needed more and more food. So what needs to be done is that a lot more research has to go in to be able to develop fertilizers and pesticides or pest repellents, as they would be called, through organic means. So we have to be able to increase our yield. One of the reasons why organically grown food is expensive is, A, the yields are lower. We don't have enough pest and disease control. So we need to improve that and to be able to grow enough safe food to feed our population. That is the biggest challenge, right?
Yeah.
So this is what we need to do. We need to put in a lot more research. It is going on internationally. There is more research going into growing organically. Pakistan needs to do it. We, in any case, I mean, to begin with, we need to do a lot of research on growing our food, because we are using all the resource of water that we have, so much so that Pakistan is facing a water crisis. Definitely. Due to shortages of water. Yes. So, I mean, that shortage of water is also caused due to this population growth. Okay. So these are things that I think our state needs to look into.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Pasha. We're running on time, so I'll take my last question to Qasim here. Qasim, Mr. Pasha talked about how there needs to be more research in order to get to a point where we can create a more sustainable food development pattern. Can you tell us what you think needs to be done as well? What steps we need to take to move forward?
Absolutely agree with Pasha Saab when it comes to the need for research. I think that is, always investing more in agricultural research is always, I think, going to have positive results. But with that also, you need, I think, a very strong and prolific awareness campaign. We are talking about a mindset that has now deeply rooted in our society about food, that would require that level of awareness to change. It is only when that awareness is there, where you will see both consumers and producers making more responsible choices. Yeah. Any person, I think any logical person, any reasonable person, when they are fully aware of the impact of their choices, of their practices, they will realize that more sustainable is better.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for joining us, Qasim, and talking to us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We'll see you again next week. Goodbye.